Lotus Field combo is one of the most complicated decks to pilot in Pioneer, and whether you're playing with it or against it this season, here are the top 5 interactions you'll need to know. The first thing you need to know is don't name Approach of the Second Sun with your Emergent ultimatums. Lotus Field combo decks these days usually win by fetching Approach of the Second Sun from their sideboard and casting it twice in the same turn in order to win the game. But if you're running a version like that, you have to make sure that you actually read the card. There's two things that you need to do with it to win the game. You need to A, have cast it earlier in the game, whether it resolved or not, and B, you have to make sure that you cast the second time from your hand. And if you don't win the game. So a common trap that people fall into is they cast Approach of the Second Sun, it resolves, it goes 7 deep into their library, and then they cast Emergent Ultimatum from their hand, and they put Approach of the Second Sun into the pile, thinking that if their opponent gives them that copy, then they will win the game on the spot. But if they give you the copy, all you're actually going to get is 7 life because you didn't cast that copy from your hand. It'll go 7 deep into your deck, and you'll be right back where you started. Apparently, this even happened at the most recent Pro Tour in Chicago, and that was probably a pretty embarrassing judge call, so don't let that happen to you. The second thing you need to know is how to protect your Thespian stages against a tapped-out opponent. So your Lotus Fields have hexproof, but your Thespian stages don't. And one of the biggest gotchas that happens to you when you're piloting the deck is you go to copy your Lotus Field with your Thespian stage, and your opponent has a Beseiju or a Field of Ruin, and they nuke your Thespian stage in response. And not only does that set you back a bunch of tempo, but it destroys your chance at a second Lotus Field and might stop you from winning the game. So there are a few things that you can do to protect yourself against this, and if your opponent's tapped out, and there's a basic land in play, then you can just play your Thespian stage out to the board on turn 3, rather than your Lotus Field, and then immediately copy one of the basic lands. And if you do that, neither Beseiju nor Field of Ruin are going to be able to hit it. And the decks that run Field of Ruin are usually like blue-white control, so they usually have basics to copy. And Beseiju is also prominent in like mono green, so you'll be able to copy some forests some percentage of the time as well. On a related note, if your opponent tries to strand your Thespian stage as a Thespian stage by playing a Pithing Needle, they have to actually name whatever your Thespian stage is a copy of at that point. So, say your Thespian stage copied an island earlier in the game, and your opponent plays a Pithing Needle and names Thespian stage. You can still activate the ability of your island because it is an island, not a Thespian stage. So, as long as it doesn't become a Thespian stage again, you can continue to use it as often as you like. Your opponent will probably call a judge because this isn't the most intuitive thing in the world, but you're going to win that fight because that's the rule. So make sure that if your opponent doesn't name island, that you know that you're still free to go about your business. And if you're playing against Lotus Field with Pithing Needle, make sure you name the right thing. Number 3 is how to protect your Thespian stage against open mana. So sometimes you're not going to be able to copy a basic when your opponent's tapped out. Sometimes you won't have the time to do that. Sometimes there isn't a basic in play. And you still have some means to protect yourself from your opponent's Field of Ruin. So say you're playing against blue-white control. They have a Field of Ruin in play, and you have your Thespian stage. And you're in this weird dance where whoever blinks first loses. If you go to copy, they'll nuke your Thespian stage with their Field of Ruin. And if they go to nuke your Thespian stage, then you can copy in response and fizzle their Field of Ruin. So you're in this weird dance, and you have the tools to break the stalemate in a way that the blue-white control player doesn't. So suppose you have a Vizier of Tumbling Sands in hand and enough mana, you can go ahead and copy your Lotus Field, and when they go to blow it up in response, you can use Vizier of Tumbling Sands to untap your Thespian stage and then activate the copy ability again. And that will resolve before the Field of Ruin, so it will be a hexproof Lotus Field at that point, and the Field of Ruin will fizzle. So the stalemate is broken in your favor. You just need to wait until you have enough mana to pull that off. Number 4 is how to win with Lair of the Hydra. So we mentioned earlier that Lotus Field decks will usually win by fetching a copy of Approach of the Second Sun from their sideboard and then casting it a couple times as their win condition. But sometimes your opponent stops you from being able to do that by exiling the thing that you're using to fetch from the sideboard. So say your opponent unmoored egos your Fae of Wishes, and now the sideboard's off limits to you. You can't use it anymore. So you need to win the game by other means. One way that Lotus Field players get around this is by adding a single copy of Lair of the Hydra to their mana base. And this is useful in a few obvious settings. So the first thing you can clearly do is you can generate a bunch of mana, you can use Hidden Strings to tap down your opponent's stuff, make a giant Hydra, and smush their face in. But there are a few tricks and tips to think about when you're going about doing that win condition. So the first thing you need to know is that the Lair of the Hydra is summoning sick the turn it comes into play. So if you play the Lair from your hand as like a surprise gotcha for your opponent, untap it with Hidden Strings, make a bunch of mana, and go to activate it, you're going to be sad because it's not going to be allowed to attack. But Any Thespian stage that's in play already that copies that Lair of the Hydra will be able to attack. It won't be summoning sick anymore as long as it was already in play at the beginning of the turn. So you can kind of give your Lair of the Hydra haste in this way. Now, if for some reason you can't have multiple copies of Lair of the Hydra attacking, and your opponent still has removal, there's still one thing you can do to try to force through the last few points of damage. All you need is a Vizier of Tumbling Sands, and for your Lair of the Hydra to actually be a Thespian stage copy, not a real one. So here's how it works. You go to combat, and you make your big Thespian stage copy of Lair of the Hydra, and go to swing with it. And at some point during your combat step, your opponent is going to try to kill it. And when they do, you can copy your Lotus Field in response. At that point, it feels like Lair of the Hydra will stop being a creature and just be a Lotus Field, but it actually won't. It will still be a creature that is legally allowed to attack, or is still attacking if you've already declared your attack. And that's because of the way the layer system in Magic works. You don't need to know the details if you don't want to, because all that matters is that this works. But if you're curious, you get the hexproof effect of your Lotus Field copy in Layer 1, and then later on down the line in Layer 4, you get the effect from the Lair of the Hydra applied earlier that made the Thespian stage an XX creature with whatever, whatever. And that is still applied, it will still be allowed to attack, and your opponent will probably call a judge, but you will still get through the last few points for lethal because their removal spell will fizzle. The last tip is actually pretty simple, but a lot of players just don't know the interaction here. If you have a Lier Disciple of the Drowned in play, and you have an adventure creature like Brazen Borrower in your graveyard, you are allowed to cast Petty Theft from your graveyard, even though Lier says you can only use instant and sorcery cards. And that feels wrong, right? It feels like you shouldn't be able to put a creature card on the stack because Lear's ability shouldn't apply to it. But the short version is you can, and the slightly longer reason you can is because the way you cast spells, you don't actually check the legality of the spell until you've already proposed putting it on the stack. So by the time you get to that point in the casting spell process, all that's left on the stack is a Petty Theft, which is a legal target for Lier. And the very long answer is if you go to the comprehensive rules, 601.2a, to propose the casting of a spell, a player first moves that card from where it is to the stack. And in this case, you're proposing casting Petty Theft by moving the card Brazen Borrower from the graveyard to the stack, exactly as you would as if it were in your hand. Then you choose modes and targets, and then you have two rules that are important. 601.2e, which says the game checks to see if the proposed spell can legally be cast, which is the legality check I was talking about earlier. And importantly, 715.3a, which says when casting an adventure card as an adventure, only the alternative characteristics are evaluated to see if it can be cast. And in this case, the alternative characteristics are, the spell Petty Theft, not the card Brazen Borrower. So the game is only looking at the copy of Petty Theft, not the creature card Brazen Borrower. Lier's effect is clearly allowed to apply to that because it's an instant, and you can go ahead. One last important detail is once Petty Theft resolves, if it resolves, you have two replacement effects deciding where it should go. One is the flashback effect from Lier that says it should go to exile, and then the other is the effect applied to adventure cards when they resolve, saying that they go to the adventure zone. And because it applies to your spell and your permanent, you get to choose which one applies. So you can even put your Brazen Borrower in the adventure zone after you've cast your Petty Theft from the graveyard and cast it as a creature again after that. Anyway, that is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know if it was helpful or if there was anything you thought I missed. Let me know if you're planning on piloting this deck during the upcoming RCQ season or not. And as always, if you liked the video, hit like. If you really liked it, hit subscribe, share it around, tell all your friends. And until then, I'll see you next time.